Hi everyone. My 10 to 15 minute presentation today is going to be on medieval Oliphants in the Mediterranean. I'm going to be focusing specifically on 11th century Oliphants. So it's important to note that the most popular example of the Oliphant in medieval history is its mention in the medieval French poem, The Song of Roland. This poem tells a highly fictionalized version of the story of the Battle of Roncesvalles. It's incredibly dramatized and illegitimate because of the ways that it was changed throughout the centuries. The Battle of Roncesvalles was originally fought between the Franks and the Basques, but over years of this dramatization, the Basques were replaced by the Saracens, which is just the medieval term used for any Muslim people, basically. In the poem, Charlemagne's supposed nephew, Roland, blows his Oliphant, an ivory horn carved from an elephant tusk, as he lays dying. This poem became extremely popular during the 11th and 12th centuries, and it's widely believed that as a result of the popularity of the poem, The Song of Roland, this is why the production of Oliphants around the Mediterranean was so greatly increased during the 11th and 12th centuries. So this poem, basically the story of the battle, was twisted throughout history to be a sort of heroic story of Christian success, or at least a sort of form of Christian propaganda during the 11th century against the Muslims, who the Moors people were the main Muslims currently living in the area at the time. So let's talk about what are Oliphants. Oliphants are wind instruments carved from the ivory tusks of elephants. These instruments would generally have a chain attached at both ends so that the Oliphant could, in theory, be hung around the owner's neck. This doesn't necessarily mean that although instrumental in nature, the Oliphants are much larger than the usual hunting horns that we would see from the Middle Ages. These hunting horns were generally made from the horns of much smaller animals. Obviously, the Oliphants are made from the tusk of an elephant, so they're extremely large. And it's thought that because of the inconvenient size of the Oliphants and the intricate carving, and the fact that they were carved from ivory, which was a very prestigious material at the time, had a lot of royal pure connotations because of its color. It's thought that the purpose of the Oliphants was likely less functional as a sort of hunting horn and more prestigious, sort of a prestige item. I wanted to show a map of the Mediterranean from this time period for clarity's sake, because it's very important to note that at this point in time, Sicily was under Fatimid rule. The Fatimids were obviously this large caliphate that reigned over this part of the southern Mediterranean. They were a branch of Muslim people at the time. As well as this, the 11th century was a very bustling time for trade between all of the cultures around the Mediterranean. So as a result, the Oliphants that were made during this time were not strictly tied to any single culture. We'll see closer into this when we examine the different groups of Oliphants, but most of them, if not all of them, are said to have been found and likely carved in southern Italy, specifically in Sicily. So we're going to see some crossover between the classic Italian styles of carving and this Fatimid inspiration. Art historian Avinoam Shalom characterized all of the 75 preserved Oliphants into 3 separate groups. They may or may not have been crafted in different places. I do want to look first at the Fatimid ivories. Here we have a picture of the Morgan casket, which was created in southern Italy in the 11th and 12th century. The first group, especially of Oliphants, are very much associated with the Morgan casket. They have very similar carving designs. We also see on the right here the Pyxis of Al-Mughira, We can see similarities in motifs from this piece of ivory, the sort of plant motifs, some of the stylization of the animals, very similar to what we will see in our Oliphants coming up. So as I said, there are three separate groups of Oliphants. It's not necessarily that these groups were made in the places I have marked here on the map, but all of them, each group is very specific to itself. So all of the Oliphants in each group are very similar to one another, and the inspiration for each one, or the sort of influence of each art style, is different depending on the group. So it's hard to say exactly where they were crafted. It's possible that they could have been crafted in a different place and moved to Sicily. It could have been that craftsmen from other countries came and worked in Sicily, and this is why they are the way that they are. But it's very hard to say. So let's talk about group one. The first 30 Oliphants of the 75 collection are considered group 1 Oliphants. They are dense, deeply carved, and they're often carved in two planes. If we can see here on some of our detail images, you can see the way that some of the plant motifs are carved further back in space than the animals, or that the back legs will be on a different plane than the front legs will be. The cut is straight, it's deep. The background has little decoration. And something also noteworthy is that the whole body of the horn is carved, is decorated, as opposed to what we will see in the next two groups coming up. But in this one, the whole body of the horn is carved as well as both ends of it. A few more interesting details here that are very specific to the group 1 Oliphants. We see these small scratch marks used for texture in fur or in feathers. The animal's eyes are generally perfectly round, and they will have a pupil in the dead center. Here you can see I've snuck in an image of the Morgan casket. For comparison, the carving is almost completely identical. We see the details in the small markings for the fur. We see the zoomorphic tails here, which are actually thought to be sort of pulled from a 9th century Syrian art style. And there's almost no difference whatsoever between the Oliphants and the Morgan casket carving. So Shalom believes that these Oliphants may have been mass-produced because of their consistency in carving and because of the sheer number of surviving examples of these Oliphants. Group 2, as we see here, characterized by having a decorated upper and lower lip, but no carvings in the mid portion or on the body. And I'm sure you're saying, like, Gib, look, but what about this one? In such cases as this Oliphant, the additional midsection carvings weren't done until several centuries later, so they were not original to the piece. These carvings tend to be one-layered. The animals appear very flat and firm, but the method of carving does feel more authentically Islamic. This sort of motif of the animals running after one another is a very common in late Abbasid and early Fatimid wood carving from Egypt. So I've inserted here an image of a Fatimid wooden plank. We can see a similarity in the flatness of the animal, in the movement, in some of the decorative carvings here. The bodies of these animals have a lot more detail. The eyes are almond-shaped. The pupils will be at the sides of the eye rather than in the center. And there are no human or fantasy creature carvings present in the group 2 Oliphants. That is to say, all of the animals here are real animals that exist in real life, as opposed to group 1, where we would see griffins, unicorns. These could have been crafted by Italian craftsmen that were heavily Fatimid inspired, or they could have been craftsmen from Egypt, from the area of Egypt. It's hard to say. And now we'll look at group 3. Group 3 is the most difficult group to find images for because there are only 8 Oliphants in the group 3 collection. So I have one image here. Worth noting that it is titled Roland's Horn does not necessarily mean that it was the horn of Roland, but at the time, it was such a popular story that many horns were claimed to be his. Some details of group 3. They lack these typical recessed bands that the first 2 groups have to hold their metal parts. The carrying chain would be threaded directly into the ivory on either side. And the carvings here are separated into 2 panels. The lower panel, which would be the one towards the lip of the horn, would have a sort of plant motifs. And then the upper one would have a narrative storyline. They featured such Fadiman motifs as we see this double sphinx here with the lotus crown, as well as these peacocks on the lower area, which were also very Fadiman inspired. It was also said that this design could have been related to the Fadiman style of 12th century Norman Palermo at the time. And finally, I want to take a look at the Horn of Ulf. This is a very interesting horn, which I'm not sure has been categorized into any of the 3 categories that I've just spoken of. It's one of the most well-known Oliphants in history. The horn is 2 feet 4 inches long, very large. And according to what is widely believed, this is a horn of tenure. It was presented to York Minster by a Norse nobleman named Ulf, sometime around 1030. The Oliphant was a representation of land and homes in an area called Dira, which Ulf was giving over to the Minster to settle debts. So essentially, it wasn't necessarily meant to be functional, but to be a symbol of land that was passed over, a physical representation of the handing over of the land. This was very common with a lot of these Oliphants. Many of them ended up in collections of churches across Europe for this reason. They were given as sort of prestige objects to the church. And we'll talk a little bit more about their usage a bit later. As far as craftsmanship goes, I would feel that this horn appears to fit into the Oliphant Group 1. We can see these centered pupils on the animals, as well as the fact that there are fantastical creatures featured here. We see the griffins on this far right image. We have a unicorn here in the center, as well as the zoomorphic tails, these 9th century Syrian inspired zoomorphic tails that turn into other creatures at the end. They're very reminiscent of the Morgan casket. But as well as we see this sort of almond shape that would have been common in group 2 of Oliphants, and it's also worth mentioning that this body in the middle is not carved, which could be one of the reasons why it's been difficult to categorize. But it is thought that this was made in southern Italy in the 11th century. So the uses for Oliphants are very much up in the air. Many of them served as holders for relics, or were stopped off at the end to hold sacred oils for special occasions in churches. It's also said that the 3 days leading up to Good Friday, the monks would not have rung the bells of the church as they normally would have, suggesting that the Oliphants that belonged to the church may have been used to call people to worship on the 3 days before Good Friday. So that could have possibly been another function of them. They essentially served many purposes, and even though they were early Islamic in their design and their inspiration, very Muslim in their inspiration, and secular in their original function as a hunting horn, their connections to the Song of Roland, this Christian propaganda poem, and their uses in many religious ceremonies at the time it does give them a Christian connection, as to be expected from the way that Christianity was really taking nearby countries by storm at the time. But they very much are an example of just how interspersed the cultures were around the Mediterranean at the time, and so many different influences that we see all coming out of the same place in Sicily.